Well, what's happening in Germany is happening all over Europe, first of all. So the fact that incumbent governments are losing is a long streak right now. Incumbent governments do not win re-elections in Europe because the mood is sour. The mood is sour because the uncertainties and anxieties are very high. Economic growth is nearly a standstill, close to zero. There are lots of refugees, lots of migrants that concern a lot of people, but concern people basically because the situation is stagnant. And frankly, nobody likes to hear about war and war talk and will there be nuclear war and we need a war mobilization day after day after day when it doesn't make sense to people. So what's happening in Germany? Well, it's the same thing that happened in France in the elections this summer, both for the European Parliament and then for the surprise election that Macron called. France is completely paralyzed politically right now. It's the same thing that happened in the Netherlands. And when you look at the approval ratings of leaders across Europe, basically they're all unpopular. Except when they come in, there's a little bit of a boost, and then that goes away over time. So Scholz is deeply unpopular at around 20% approval rating, maybe 60% disapproval rating, and the rest not knowing what to think. Macron almost exactly in the same situation. Now, specifically in Germany, but again, I would say it's a European-wide situation. We have to start from the notion that there's a pretty deep and disruptive change in the world economy taking place right now. We are moving from internal combustion engines to electric vehicles. Well, the internal combustion engine has been the heart and soul of the German economy for a century. And Germany is the second largest EV producer, but way behind China and not competitive with China right now. And so there's an underlying challenge. A second fundamental change underway, of course, as everybody knows in this world, is the move to artificial intelligence and digital. And where is Europe in this in general? The big players are all American or Chinese. And Europe regulates, but it doesn't produce. And it arrests digital platform owners like Durov, but it doesn't have its own base, which is extraordinary. So Europe is really in a bind in the sense that the world economy technology fundamentally is transforming extraordinarily rapidly. And one can also add that electric vehicles are basically not automobile producers. They're basically sophisticated software producers. And Europe depends on its auto industry. And Germany utterly depends on its auto industry. And Volkswagen is in trouble and can't compete right now. So the last thing in the world Europe needs right now is a prolonged war that has no purpose, that has a boomerang effect directly on the European economy by the cutoff of low-cost energy, which at least was a competitive advantage and a very significant one for German industry. So it's not only the automotive industry that is in trouble, but of course the entire chemical sector is closing down right and left, and the deeper transformations that are needed in the chemical sector are also paralyzed right now. We need deeper change. We're moving to green and digital economies. The one place in the world that is just doing its job, getting its act together, building capacity phenomenally is China. China's not doing anything wrong, not cheating on anybody on its economics. What it's doing is building capacity. So suddenly the United States Treasury Secretary opens her eyes and says, by the way, she's a good friend, but so not right on this issue. Opens her eyes and says, China has overcapacity. No, sorry. We're in the middle of stupid, endless, perpetual wars that are only threatening, only destructive, only boomeranging, and China's building its economy. And then we have the stories so absurd, by the way, in your absurd press in Britain and my absurd press in the United States, which gets everything wrong about the war, but then gets everything wrong about China also, because it says, oh, China's in the great deep crisis. China is building the industrial capacity for the future. Germany is closing down shop. Europe is in disarray. Everybody talks about a war economy that the public doesn't, every leader that absolutely doesn't want, is absurd, is tragic, is completely in the wrong direction. So that's the story of the day. And are we surprised that the voters continue to vote against the incumbent parties? Of course we shouldn't be. They have no approval. They have no strategy. They're following some CIA plan from the 1990s that we're going to run the world. And we is not Europe, by the way, it's the United States. And Europe has fallen into line. And the voters, who are not exactly part of this agreement, are saying, what the heck is going on? So in all of this, the anti-incumbent vote is completely understandable. You have that vote in many dimensions, but from my point of view, the most important point about these elections in Thuringia and Saxony is that the anti-incumbent parties won, and the anti-incumbent parties agree on the most basic point: stop the war. Thank you, because we don't want it. It's not helping us. Least of all is it helping Ukraine. It just kills 1,000 to 2,000 Ukrainians every day. So that's what the public voted for overwhelmingly. And the current coalition could barely muster a vote. And the Greens, who I find the most absurd of all of this, because they're the least green and they're the most militaristic, could not even enter the parliament of Thuringia, if I know the updated count correctly. So this current coalition is completely losing the support of the public. But that's the same as happened in France. That's the same as happened in the Netherlands. That's the same as is happening election by election in Europe.
Indeed. And in Britain, by the way, we've had the fastest decline in popularity of an incoming government that I can ever remember. The Prime Minister's, our new Prime Minister's ratings have completely collapsed and have fallen into negative territory.
What's amazing to me, Alexander, is that they come in and they read the script of the party of the government that they just defeated, because it's the U.S. script, and they pledge that they're going to do exactly the same as the party that they just defeated, but they're doing that everywhere.
Yeah. Well, this is my next point, because there is no, we have an expression, I don't know whether you have it in American English, which is, when you're in a hole, stop digging. Absolutely. We are not doing that. We're digging deeper. Now, Michael Schulenberg, whom I think you know,
very well,
just written,
and admire very much.
And he's just written a wonderful piece, which is in various places, about the fact that the European Parliament has just passed another incredible resolution demanding more war, more support for Ukraine, saying that the only acceptable outcome in Ukraine is victory and defeat for Russia, calling for more support for Ukraine in terms of weapons, more militarization, in other words. And this is what all the leaders are saying. In Britain, in France, in Germany still, because Merz, who's the new Christian, the leader of the Christian Democrats and likely the next chancellor of Germany, he's not saying anything different. It is such a complete misjudgment of the mood of people in Europe now. And it is so completely self-destructive of the state of Europe's economy. What has to happen to make people change?
I think the fundamental problem for Europe in this regard is that Brussels is the capital not only of the EU, but also of NATO. And the two became exactly the same thing. They weren't exactly the same thing 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. But now the EU, the European Union, which is basically a monetary and economic construction, I meant to say market construction, has become part of the US military arm. And so all we hear is the military from the European Union. That was not the mission of the European Union. In fact, it was exactly the opposite. Originally, was to make the interconnected economy so that militarization would not be the main subject. But with the NATO and European capitals being co-located, and of course with this push by the United States since 1991, active, designed, delusional, destructive push for global dominance and hegemonic status and full spectrum dominance, whatever you want to call it, Europe has really been pulled out of all that it knows how to do and should do, which is to build a 21st century infrastructure to support at the scale that is needed of the 450 million people in Europe, the digital sector that can compete with the US and can compete with China, but it's not happening now at all. It's war all the time. And the fact that van der Leyen is just reelected in the context of one of the terrible moments of Europe shows that this script is still unchanging. It's still coming from Washington, and it's still read by these hapless, unpopular, unsupported European politicians. It's very sad. I love Europe. I love the quality of life in Europe, and I love the idea of Europe getting its act together to be at a scale which can be a counterweight to the United States, which can deal as Europe with China, which is fine. The two ends of the Eurasian continent should be dealing directly with each other, not through Washington, not through Washington's dictates. But this is exactly not happening anymore.
Which is, of course, I mean, the connections between the two parts of Eurasia used to happen. I mean, there were Roman embassies to the court in China. We have records of them. I mean, it's not. We have the Silk Road. We had all of those things.
If you want a growth and well-being agenda, it's Europe and China working together for a 21st century peaceful Eurasia. Russia has an important role in that. Central Asia has an important role in that. Western Asia has an important role in that. South Asia. In other words, this could be a wonderful time, actually. We need and have the chance to upgrade quality of life, technology, digital services, interconnectivity, fast rail, so many fantastic things. And we're doing the opposite right now. Russia's the enemy. We can never even talk to them. We can't even be in the room anymore. This is absurd and self-destructive. China, we can't deal with China. Washington says we can't deal with China. Well, this is utterly self-destructive again. So what we should be doing right now, and by the way, Eurasia is a good concept, and it's been there since the Roman and Han empires dealt with each other constructively. This is what the future really should be about, and we're just doing the opposite right now. And I have to tell you, I mean, you know very well, and you clarify this every day, both of you, that Washington meddles a lot. Europe's main mission in life should not be promoting American hegemony. Europe's main mission in life was not to make sure that America could have its military surrounding Russia. For God's sake, was this really the most vital thing in the world, to provoke open war and the destruction of relations between Europe and Russia? No, but the US walked Europe into this. And interestingly, if you go back to even the start of the Ukraine war, which, please, everybody remember, is February 2014, not February 2022, as the mainstream media would tell it. This war started when the US brought down a government in Ukraine. The Europeans were there. I don't think the European role was very sophisticated at all in that moment. And the European role was whipsawed by the United States, who our point person was caught on tape saying not a very nice expletive about Europe at the time, which people may recall. But the point is, even on the eve of the coup, the European foreign ministers were there making a deal with the incumbent government for early elections later in 2014, but for an end to this violent overthrow. And so the Europeans made a deal. The United States basically put its foot down, said, we're getting rid of Yanukovych right now, together with the right-wing extremists in the uprising. And what did Europe say? It didn't say, well, wait a minute, we have a deal already, we need to enforce that. The Europeans from that moment would not raise their voice to the United States. And that's when all of this started spiraling down. So even at the last moment, when Europe could have salvaged something and said, we can deal straightforwardly, we've reached an agreement, we have a diplomatic approach, we have a way forward politically that we have agreed with the government of Ukraine, the Europeans couldn't hold it one day, and then can't even open their mouths about the circumstances. That's sad.
It's also astonishing to somebody who remembers recent European history. I mean, I remember Willy Brandt, I remember Helmut Schmidt, I remember the various French leaders, de Gaulle, Pompidou, Giscard, Mitterrand. They were Chirac. They were all able to speak with restraint and,
by the way,
contain the Americans, say no to the Americans.
It is
Thatcher
fascinating.
said no to the Americans.
Well, look, Germany, France, and Russia in 2003 said no to the Americans about the Iraq War. And then they were proved right, and the US prevailed over the politics of Europe. It's crazy. So it's exactly true. This is not so deep that European leaders, if they had some gumption, actually could not say to the United States, your ideas don't make so much sense, and we have our own issues and our own interests. They could do that. And you point that out, and it was really there, and it was there as late as 2003. But the turning point, we already saw it in 2008, when Bush Jr. pushed NATO enlargement. I spoke to some of the European leaders. There are some that are still there, and they said to me, "What's going on with your government? They promised they wouldn't do this, that this is too provocative. Why is he pushing for NATO enlargement to Ukraine, for God's sake?" And we know at the Bucharest summit that Merkel, the French, and others were trying to stop. George, don't do it. You don't have to do it. And George put his foot down, and Victoria Nuland, my colleague at Columbia University now, NATO ambassador, put her foot down. And you have to agree that NATO's going to enlarge to Ukraine. And it was after that, essentially, it seems that Europe completely lost its voice as Europe. When Minsk was a way out for Ukraine not to lose the Donbass and not to be engaged in terrible war. And the Russians said diplomacy and, some autonomy so that Russians can speak Russian, ethnic Russians can speak Russian in Ukraine. Perfectly sensible, normal. The United States said, no, not interested. The Ukrainian regime said, no, not interested. And what did Merkel and Sarkozy and Hollande do afterwards? Hollande? Nothing. They were supposed to be the guarantors of this. Complete quiet. So Europe basically left the geopolitical stage, gave it over to Washington. I've had European leaders say very weird things to me when I've asked them, why don't you stand up for European interests? They say, oh, they treat us like children in Washington. But come on. You don't let yourself get treated like a child as a leader of a European country.
That brings me to the next thing I wanted to ask, which is that this mood of fatalism that is now taking hold in Europe, which is very corrosive. People are very, very gloomy. All of the things that you said could happen, the digitalization, the development of the infrastructure, all of this, it is doable. It can be done. We have the resources in Europe. We have the financial reserves. We have the technological skills. We have the industrial skills. And if we start to do them, I think people would find them exciting and enjoyable and energizing. And it would create optimism and buoyancy. And a lot of these problems that seem so intractable about migration, for example, I think they could be handled much more effectively and successfully in the context of an optimistic, buoyant Europe. But do you agree with me? I mean, we can do it, and it would be fun. I mean, if I could put it like that.
Yeah, I make lists for a living on economic competitiveness and sustainable development and many other things. And first of all, Europe's quality of life is the highest in the world. I give a lot of credit for that. There is, and I appreciate it, approve of it, a very good work-life balance. You can make fun of it, lots of vacation time, shorter work hours, but come on, that's a good life, because Europe is highly productive, highly sophisticated. You look at top-ranked universities in the world. Europe, of course, invented the university network 1,000 years ago, and it's got the greatest university network still in the world. Life expectancy, highest in the world. Japan is actually at the top, but for a region, Europe is extraordinary. Scientific capacity, extremely strong. All the makings are there. So what is this disarray? We don't trade. We're protectionists. We don't deal with Russia. We need a war economy. Everything wrong. And of course, one of the reasons is the United States has its agenda. I mean, it's crazy. It's delusional in my view. It is this hegemonic agenda to this moment, although it's absurd and completely out of reach. Europe was yanked into it, but the U.S. agenda is not even that Europe is a part of that necessarily. The U.S. likes its giants. Europe doesn't have its successful global competitors now in the artificial intelligence space at all. There's nowhere to be seen. And that's true across a lot of the new technologies right now. Europe needs its focus on that future, which is a very interesting and very positive future potentially. And Europe is not building that out at all. And where is the strategy? You think van der Leyen's going to come up with that strategy? That Kaja Kallas is going to come up with that strategy? I thought back in 2019, when I was speaking with the then early commission, when Europe made its Green Deal, I said, okay, this is kind of an industrial strategy for how to make a modern transformation and to lead. And it could be. China had its industrial strategy. They called it Made in China 2025. And by the time we're reaching 2025, they achieved all their objectives, actually. It was a very impressive document that freaked out the United States, and actually China succeeded in it. It became at the cutting edge of essentially every major green and digital technology looking forward. Europe has abandoned that. Now, one clue to that also is not only the craziness of the neocon agenda, which remains entrained as it fails and digs us deeper into the hole. But when I spoke recently with a big authority in Europe on the digital economy, she told me that she had gotten involved in some industrial issues with Brussels, and that the thing that overwhelmed her about Brussels was the American lobbying in Brussels, the dominance of the American narrow interests swaying all of the decision-making, the regulatory apparatus, and the rest, because there's a lot of U.S. lobbying money in Brussels. They know what they're doing. That's how America, it still has some technological edge, but basically our government has been handed over to plutocratic lobbying groups sector by sector, and the US has done that to Brussels as well. Europe has its own semi-tradition of that, but the United States really accelerated it. So it's not only the geopolitical side, it's purely the commercial side, and Europe let itself be exposed to that as well. It's very sad. And, the anti-incumbent mood is typically an anti-Brussels mood, perfectly understandable because that's anti-incumbency. And it's also understandable because what Brussels has on offer is just not very exciting. But I'll tell you, for Europe or any other region in the world, in my view, you better have scale right now. China's big, India's big, the US is big. To say we don't like Brussels, and so we just want to do it in Saxony or Thuringia. Well, you're not going to have much of an auto industry that way. You're not going to have a digital industry that way. You're not going to be able to make it. So we need a Europe of scale, but not doing this ridiculous bidding of the United States and digging the hole deeper every single day. And they just don't get it. By the way, I was on an Irish television show yesterday. Apparently, I didn't know the other people, but one of them was a minister in the government taking me on. I just found they didn't know even the basic facts, the chronology, how Europe has gotten into this. And I discover, of course, I listen to you guys every day to keep me informed, but people don't know even the most basic step-by-step TikTok of how, or not TikTok, we can't say that anymore, of how we got into this. But if you know year by year what happened, it's a completely different story from the unprovoked attack of 2022, this absurd narrative. And that's another part of why Europe is just so much on the back foot on this, because people are not even aware of this, how this mess has evolved.
This is completely true, by the way. I have a friend of mine who worked until very recently in the British government, and he's been telling me all kinds of things about how ministers are briefed and how profoundly ignorant they are. They are very, very poorly informed, not just about foreign policy, but about most things, as it turns out. And they are never there long enough to learn. I mean, that's the other problem. I mean,
this is actually
endless.
The mainstream media collapsed on us. You can't get a sensible word in the FT, which I used to read not only for facts but for pleasure, actually, because I thought the writing was good, and everything has deteriorated with that. our government, the politicians don't know, apparently, because their fact universe is pretty limited, and maybe from reading the mainstream media. And I thought what Putin said in an interview in Figaro in 2017, that is reproduced in a wonderful forthcoming book of historian Jonathan Haslam about all of this. Putin said, the politicians, he said, I've dealt with 3 presidents. You talk to them, it's interesting. They have some ideas. But by the afternoon, the men in the dark suits with the blue ties have visited them and have straightened them out about things. And so that's the U.S. presidents. Of course, they're kept in line. There is an agenda, a direction. I think it's been going on for 30 years in the United States. Europe was yanked into it by the United States. That's what they're told. Okay, you do this, you do that. Everybody reads from the script. Nobody knows even the basics right now. Everyone sees things in this incredibly weird way. Incidentally, to digress, the minister said to me, or one of the participants on this Irish show, the Russians would never negotiate. Of course, you take on that trope all the time. But I said, excuse me, it was Russian diplomacy that made Minsk. It was Putin that put forward a draft security arrangement. It was Russia that negotiated with Ukraine in Ankara in March and April 2022, and it was Boris Johnson that marched in to stop that. You say the Russians don't negotiate, and he's sitting there. I don't think he knew, frankly. It wasn't just that it was debating points on his side. I don't think he has any idea at all of the actual basic situation that has brought his country into a war zone.
And which is affecting the morale and the material conditions of his people, which is what a government should be focused on more than anything else. Peace, of course, being the precondition of achieving those 2 things. Professor Sachs, again, thank you very much for joining us. I'm going to hand over to Alex. I'm sure he's got a few questions. If you could just stay with us just for a very short time.
Sure. Yeah, you have time for
I do.
3, 4 questions?
Of course.
Great. Ralph Steiner says, the USA and especially Britain seem totally bent on defeating Russia. Is this because the Anglo-American empire needs the resources of Russia to keep going?
That's a great question. First of all, this is the Anglo-American empire, albeit in decline. This story goes back to, I would say, to the 1830s and 1840s. If I say Europe is fulfilling the American delusion, I would say America is fulfilling the British delusion. The great story of Britain and Russia is, with the short exception, Britain has been consumed with russophobia from the 1830s onward, for no reason, by the way, except somebody got it in their heads around 1830 that Russia was going to invade India through the Khyber Pass, and that this was going to be the great game of Asia, and the crown jewel of the British Empire was going to be threatened by Russia. The point is, this kind of great power game goes back almost 2 full centuries now. Britain has been in the lead. There's a wonderful study by a historian named Gleason, written in 1970, The Origins of British Russophobia. Why did Britain come to hate Russia? And he goes through basically every speech, every news story from the end of the Napoleonic Wars, when Britain and Russia were on the same side, to the emergence of this great Russophobia in the 1840s, to the Crimean War, which is almost identical to what we're playing out right now, because the Crimean War was a contrived war by Britain, and France to get Russia out of the Black Sea. We're in the Second Crimean War, the continuation of the First Crimean War with a bit of a gap right now. Anyway, Gleason looks, he spends a whole learned book, and he can't find anything that Russia did that created the Russophobia. It arose because Britain, which at that time was the world hegemon, didn't like the fact that there was a big Russia. That's all. So Russia was a threat because it was big. By the way, that's the reason the United States hates Russia and China, because they are an affront to American hegemony. That's all. Why does America hate China? Not because of what China's done. China's pulled itself from poverty. It's pulled itself to the front lines of world technology. It's extraordinarily impressive and good for the world. The U.S. hates it because now there's a peer that they don't want. So, yes, this is about the Anglo-American empire. Boris Johnson said so, by the way. We have to defeat Russia, otherwise Western hegemony will be over. Well, anything Boris Johnson says is idiocy, so there you have it. But he explained it quite well.
Gift of the Gab asks, what's Jeffrey's opinion on one world government?
You know, it's complicated in that I am a big believer that we need global agreements on certain things like getting rid of nuclear weapons. We need global agreements on protecting the oceans. We need global agreements on protecting the air from poisons. I want global agreements on keeping space demilitarized and so forth. So my view of government in general is an idea that is actually comes from the Catholic Church originally. It's the idea of subsidiarity, which is you do things at the level that you need to do them. So if you can run your schools and your clinics at the village level, do it there. You don't do it at a global government level. That's crazy. You don't even have to do it at a national level. If you need an intercity rail, you don't do that at the city level, you do that at the national level. If you need to transport power across nations, you do that at a regional level, like the European Union. If you need to do things at the global level, like protecting the oceans or space or something extremely important for me, nuclear, in my view, I should say, nuclear disarmament rather than nuclear Armageddon, you have to do that at the global level. So it's not one or the other. We do things when we need to do things together, as opposed to individually or in our families or so forth. When we need to do things together to build infrastructure or to take some protections for our safety, do it at the most local level you can do it, but not at a level so low that you can't solve the problem. I don't want Europe to solve the problem of its competitiveness at a country by country level alone, because I want Europe to have some champions that can compete with China, with India, with the United States and so forth. And that is why I like the European Union for that purpose. So the question is, what are we trying to get out of government and where can we best get it? And that idea of subsidiarity is go to the lowest, most local level you can, because that gives the most diversity, the most freedom, the most ability to meet the local tastes and local needs. But don't pretend that there aren't issues that are not national or regional or global.
From Sanjeva, it's a two-part question. Actually, Sanjeva, me and Alexander will answer the question in detail. But from Sanjeva, what were your thoughts, Professor Sachs, on Modi's visit to Kiev? Very quick visit, a 7-hour visit from what Sanjeva is telling us.
Look, India is one of the world's 4 superpowers in my view. That's the United States, China, Russia, and India. India should be engaged in global problem solving to the extent that it can. I think the meeting was just normal. Modi has close relations with Putin, which is excellent. I like the BRICS also. I think that it's a constructive force for the world. And so I'm happy that they take this step. I don't think he heard anything at all constructive. Everything that comes out of Zelensky is delusional right now and destroying Ukraine. It's not solving anything. But I'm glad that they went, and I like Indian diplomacy. And I want to see more of it. And I want India in the UN Security Council as a permanent member because it's one of the world's major powers.
From Ralph Steiner, do the people instigating these wars care about the human cost incurred?
No.
Or is it the almighty dollar, the primary factor? Or is it something more insidious?
I can tell you for sure, no one counts the dead in these positions of power. You don't even hear the words. You don't even hear the hand-wringing. It's not even faked. They don't even think that they need to fake it to show a human side. I haven't heard anyone in U.S. authority bemoan the 500 or 600 or 700,000 Ukrainians dead. You don't even hear it. But by the way, this has been American war making from the start. And it was war making of America's been bombing civilian populations, mass bombings from Korea, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. America's instigated wars all over the place, causing hundreds of thousands or millions of deaths that we never even hear about. No, nobody counts the dead in this. And it's one of the most shocking things for me. I mean, as a human being, also, I take it, I'm an economist. I don't like waste. I like things being done efficiently. I don't like wasting human lives. I don't like the suffering, the mass suffering. It should be our goal every day. How do we stop the killing? It's not even the goal. The goal is how do we win, not how do we stop the killing. The mindset is nothing about how to stop the killing. That's weakness. You have to win. That's the thing that counts. And so it's a very good question. And the answer is absolutely straightforward. And I can say I've been through so many American wars. I'm giving you a comprehensive answer. They don't care.
Professor Sachs from Shalendra, I read your article on Matt Taibbi's Substack. It was very informative, although you did cover it on the Duran.
Yes.
Thank you for that. And the final question for Professor Sachs coming from Zarael. Professor Sachs, where did the Monroe Doctrine go?
That's interesting. The Monroe Doctrine, 1823, said to the European powers two very interesting things. We only remember one of them. But the Monroe Doctrine actually says two things. One, it says, don't meddle in our neighborhood, okay, to the European powers. The second thing it says actually is, we won't meddle in your neighborhood. That is not so often mentioned, but it's very clearly stated because they stated something for world opinion, and it was reciprocity. It was the Kantian imperative. Don't do to us what we wouldn't want you to do. Don't do it to us, and we won't do the same to you, because neither of us should meddle in each other's affairs. Well, of course, the U.S. position, especially since 1898, since the U.S. finished its continental genocides and its continental conquest and said, okay, now we got to get a world empire because we're a little bit behind the Europeans. And launched a war on false premises, a kind of a weapons of mass destruction war against Spain in 1898 to claim Puerto Rico and the Philippines and Cuba briefly and so forth. Now the U.S. position is don't expect any reciprocity from us. We can go wherever we want, but don't you dare come close to our neighborhood. So the literal thing that is killing Ukraine, the literal thing every day is the U.S. claim that NATO can go where it wants, when it wants, with any partner, and in particular up to Russia's 2,100-kilometer border with Ukraine, and it's none of Russia's business at all. This is the central claim. I had a long talk with Jake Sullivan about this in 2021. He said, that's our principle. That's a principle, Jake? Are you kidding? That's an absurdity guaranteed to get us into endless war. And we don't like it, do we? So if Russia said we're going to have a military base on the Rio Grande on the Mexican side, the Washington would say, oh, that's just fine. Mexico and Russia, you can do whatever you want. No, we'd be at war in 10 minutes. And we basically nearly ended the world in October 1962 when the Soviet Union tried to install a base and offensive nuclear weapons in Cuba. No, you have no right to do that, even though the US had offensive nuclear weapons pointed at the Soviet Union and Turkey. Everything's asymmetry when you are the hegemon. We do what we want, you do what we say. This is the whole point of all of this. And if the United States even reread its own Monroe Doctrine, it would learn two critical things. You know what? I am a believer I'm not a believer in the U.S. meddling in internal affairs of Latin American countries, but I'm happy to say to the rest of the world, you keep your militaries out of our neighborhood in the United States, but we should do the same. I want our military bases all over the world closed down, for God's sake. We don't need them. The United States is not threatened. The only threat the United States faces, the only military threat the United States faces, period, is a nuclear war. That's it. So if we don't provoke other nuclear superpowers, if when Russia says, no, please don't move NATO to our border, we say, we understand. We have kind of the same idea. We wouldn't be at war. If we would listen to China say, don't arm Taiwan right now. We don't want a war across the Taiwan Straits. If we just listened for one moment and did what we would do, we'd actually be perfectly safe in the United States. We have no security crisis. We are safe except for nuclear war. Don't provoke one. That's the bottom line. But we are provoking everywhere because they're not after our safety. They are after hegemony, which is a crazy idea. And the idea that the US could be a global hegemon in a world of India, Russia, China, it's completely delusional and extremely dangerous. And that's why we're in the mess that we're in.